Re-releasing popular video game titles is all the rage at the moment, with old classics and really not that old classics being reimagined, remastered, rebuilt, and whatever this is. Some of these re-releases hit, and some are misses. So let me ask, what makes a good remake? In this video, we'll be focusing on remakes. None of those remasters or reimaginings. More money grabs. I'm looking at you, Naughty Dog. Not gonna lie, I take the opportunity to dunk on The Last of Us Part 1 here, but it deserves it, so what can I say? Remakes in recent years have been met with both praise and criticism, with different remakes excelling in areas where others fall flat. This is largely due to how each remake has gone about trying to adapt the original for modern audiences, with the examples we'll cover all having their respective strengths and weaknesses. Things to consider include gameplay, graphics, audio, and narrative changes, as well as some other key points we'll get to later. An important side note to make is this is all my own little brain dump, so let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with what's discussed. Video game remakes feel as though they've become the new trend within the games industry, growing in popularity in recent years despite being released as early as 1990. Castlevania, notable for starting the Metroidvania genre alongside Metroid, was remade in 1993. Super Mario All-Stars, Mega Man, and Dragon Quest all followed, just to name a few examples. Remakes aren't limited to the gaming space, with film reimagining old media as far back as the 1910s. There are a couple of reasons to dig up old media and recreate them with modern technologies, with them all pretty much coming back to accessibility. Firstly, some of that media is no longer accessible, and you would have to go out and buy a whole new console to be able to play one or two games of the oldie past. Making a remake on current platforms allows players to experience old content without the need to buy an older console, which is also second-hand, and the studio would make no money from it. Second, some of these older games are not appealing to play for modern audiences. For example, Resident Evil 4 is a classic, but due to its tank control system, it puts off a lot of potential new players. The remake of RE4 updates these controls, and therefore appeals to a wider audience. A studio might also just have a great IP on their hands, and can see the money-making potential of a remake. Remakes in the past decade have felt like they've had more impact, perhaps due to the nostalgia of playing old classics with new, shiny graphics. Improvements in the technology used to make video games have hugely advanced, allowing us to see visual differences from the get-go. Graphics aren't everything though, so let's get down to the real question. What makes a good remake? Here we'll take a look at some of the most notable remakes of the past few years. Here are the games that I'll be talking about in this next section. Whilst I won't be including spoilers about the narratives of the games or showing footage of key gameplay moments, I will be talking about these games. So, if you find out something you didn't want to know, well, don't say I didn't warn you. Sticking with the Resident Evil franchise, Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes all saw success after being upgraded into the new RE engine. As a side note, I'd like to mention that whilst the RE3 remake didn't receive the same reception from the community as the other remakes, in terms of the game's quality and sales, it was a success. Capcom has a deep understanding of the Resident Evil audience and have added a lot of fan service to their remakes, building upon gameplay elements, fleshing out characters, and adding Easter eggs referencing previous games. The original RE4 was a hard act to follow given its status within the gaming world. We received multiple titles from its many prototypes due to its long development phase, including Haunting Ground and Devil May Cry. RE4 was originally lined up to be RE3, but its development took so long that Capcom decided to release another game it had in the works, to not leave fans without a mainline installment. RE4 also had a massive sphere of influence within the gaming space, popularizing the third-person over-the-shoulder camera. Although it wasn't the first game to use this camera view, it was the first game to implement it effectively. Games that took direct inspiration from RE4's design choices included God of War 2018, Uncharted, as well as The Last of Us and Dead Space. The teams behind these games all understood why the over-the-shoulder third-person camera worked, with each of these titles feeling completely different to one another. The RE4 remake added in new systems that complemented the old gameplay, balancing enemies and damage to make you feel confident in Leon's abilities, whilst not being overpowered. One of these systems that stands out is the knife. In the original RE4, the knife is a basic tool. You could stab enemies, boxes, bear traps, bosses, and C4s, but the premise was the same. You stab. In the remake, the knife has become an onion, with layers of gameplay possibilities all at Leon's fingertips. The first gameplay addition is none other than the parry. Inspired by Capcom's own Street Fighter III series, the parry is a mechanic that adds a whole host of new possibilities to the game. Allowing for new combat decisions, the parry gives players more options to play out each combat scenario. Because who wouldn't want to parry a chainsaw with a little knife? Not only did they add in a parry mechanic, they added in the knife durability system to compensate for this new option of dealing with combat encounters. And did I mention you can now do stealth kills? They didn't think, oh, let's add something new to the gameplay and call it a day. They really took the time to think about what would enhance their industry-inspiring combat from the original, and integrated it for modern audiences. But it doesn't stop there, because they integrated the knife so well into the game that now you can craft bolts for the bolt thrower using those same knives. So deciding whether you even want to use the knife in close combat encounters becomes another choice the player must make. They've given you the tools, and it is up to you to decide on how you're going to play.
What am I going to do with a knife?
All of the R remakes to date have been well received, hyping up future remakes of the franchise. However, next I'd like to focus on the history of these remakes. It's easy to say now with RE7, RE8, RE2 Remake, RE3 Remake, and RE4 Remake that Capcom understands how to make a great survival horror game. However, when you look at the timeline of these games' releases, how did they know that they were onto a winning formula? Resident Evil 7, a fresh take on the franchise released in 2017, was a massive success. This was in part due to Capcom's new Reach for the Moon engine, better known as the RE engine, which now hosts games including Monster Hunter Rise, Street Fighter VI, and the upcoming Dragon's Dogma 2. The RE2 remake was released in 2019 and was in development since 2015. The RE3 remake also started development shortly after work on the RE2 remake had begun. Capcom didn't know if this new formula would be successful with RE7, and they'd already greenlit 2 remakes before it had been released. We can only speculate based on the feedback the games have received as to why they are so popular. However, I believe in this instance it goes far beyond the Resident Evil franchise. It could be argued that Capcom already had the hard work done for them given the success of the original Resident Evil games, but I think there's more to the story. In recent years, Capcom has been delivering great project after great project. Monster Hunter World, Devil May Cry 5, Mega Man 11, The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, Monster Hunter Rise, Street Fighter VI. These are just some of the titles dropped recently that were very well received by their respective audiences. I believe Capcom are on a roll with their remakes because they clearly have an overarching strategy in place for all of their games. It feels like the developers in charge of the games are fans of the franchises they're working on, and understand from a player's perspective exactly what they enjoy and where the pain points are within the previous installments. The player's experience is at the forefront of the game design choices, which is clearly felt within Capcom's gaming communities. The player's experience is something Naughty Dog's developers talked about when news of The Last of Us Part 1 came around. Released in 2023, this new version was built for the PS5 and features updated character models, better lighting effects, new animations, and quality of life changes to combat. We also don't talk about the PC release. Whilst there were improvements made on the original, they felt a bit unnecessary to warrant a remake, especially when the game's graphics had already been updated in the PlayStation 4 remaster. The goal of this project was to allow players to play The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 back-to-back with no visual disparities, and whilst that goal was achieved, the impact this game had as a remake was minimal. Looking back on this remake, it doesn't feel as bad as it did when it was released, but it doesn't feel good either. Personally, I think half the problem lies with the IP being milked for all that it is worth, as we now have 4 iterations of the original The Last of Us, with The Last of Us Part 2 also being remastered this year and the TV series being made. I'm surprised The Last of Us 3 remake hasn't been announced yet. This idea of visual disparity and that The Last of Us didn't hold up and needed to be upgraded didn't sit well with fans of the franchise, and I believe it comes down to respect for the game. The original does have visual differences to Part 2. However, it didn't look awful, the combat was good, and the narrative is, dare I say it, some of the best we've seen in gaming. The visual upgrade is further reduced when you compare it to The Last of Us Remastered. The graphics had already been enhanced once. It was surprising they wanted to do it again. When you think of The Last of Us, you think of Joel and Ellie and the story that they tell. The remake felt as though Naughty Dog was unhappy with the project and wanted to create a shinier, updated model and forget about where it came from. The remake felt like an insult to the source material that touched so many people, and in doing so not only disrespects the original game, but also the personal experience of the players that chose to expose themselves to that journey. The remake appealed to two types of people: new players of the franchise, or old fans that fell in love with their experience so much that they wanted to experience that same journey again. Perhaps this is why The Last of Us TV series was so well received, because the only way to build upon the main structure of the game, the narrative, the facial expressions, and the emotive reactions, was to make it more human, literally. It opened up the story to new audiences that wouldn't or couldn't experience the game, sharing Joel and Ellie's story of morality through the medium we know best, real human interaction. The TV show, in a way, is also a remake of the first game, just shown in a different format. And it, like The Last of Us Part 1, adds little value to those who have already experienced the original. For gamers, it might even take away more than it gives. It removes the viewer's personal connection to the characters as your ability to control them goes away. The original game implemented dialogue and gameplay sections to an unrivaled level, which goes away when you change the medium to one where every scene is scripted and rehearsed, trying to recreate plot-developing cinematics. The fight for survival in the game is an unprecedented experience, carefully planning routes through abandoned buildings infested with zombies and exploring every nook and cranny to make sure you find enough ammo to even have a chance at the next encounter. This doesn't reflect in the TV show because film has a different set of tools to video games, and in this case, I personally don't feel as though they beat the immersive design of the original. The player has control within the game, thus feeling more responsible for events that happen, whether they are caused by the player or scripted in linearity. Within the show, you're just watching someone else's journey, and it loses its impact, especially in key moments where the player is forced to take action despite their own moral compass. But we're getting distracted. The Last of Us, in all its progressive releases, has tried to become more visually realistic. However, what made this game special was the realism of the characters. Their choices and reactions to scenarios and expression of feeling really resonated with its audience, making the updated visuals in Part 1 a nice to have, but not something that adds much value to the source material. It's here that I'd like to pause and reflect on the disparity between Capcom's and Naughty Dog's approach. They both approach remakes with a different attitude. Capcom appears to innovate, whereas Naughty Dog appears to fix. This might be because The Last of Us had very little space to innovate new ideas, so they took a different direction. However, this raises the question of whether it even needed a remake in the first place. Something to be mindful of is whether or not the remake feels like a replacement of the original game, or whether the two can coexist in their own right. Either way, it is clear that there are two focuses when it comes to remakes: gameplay and visuals. Perhaps a good remake can be judged on whether changes made to the gameplay and/or visuals are innovative or not. Like The Last of Us Part 1, another remake that set out to exceed visual expectations was Demon's Souls. The remake was released in 2020 and is one of those remakes that gets everyone confused with remasters. Whilst there are changes that warrant the remake title, the remake was incredibly true to the original in terms of gameplay and level design. With the remake being handed over to Bluepoint Games, areas became visually stunning, although they faced some controversy from old fans of the original for changing the atmosphere of levels. The original game was only playable on the PS3, Sony's worst-selling console, so the new version allowed the game to become a lot more accessible to players, especially after the success of FromSoft's other titles. One of the main goals of the remake was to remain true to the original whilst improving the game in line with modern hardware. Some people say that there were gameplay issues in the original game that could have been fixed within the remake. However, Bluepoint decided to keep them in, potentially as they didn't want to make gameplay decisions that weren't in line with From Software's original creation. I also say that Bluepoint decided to make this decision, but we actually don't know if Bluepoint had any authorization from FromSoft to make gameplay changes. FromSoft's Souls games are meant to be a challenge, and tampering with the game design could have changed the formula too much for Souls fans, causing a whole separate issue. That being said, there was an opportunity here to rectify issues such as gimmick boss fights, clunky combat, or build upon unique mechanics like the world tendency system. The main consideration to make with Demon's Souls is whether the new graphics were innovative enough to compensate for a lack of change within the gameplay. The remake possibly feels like it was trying to make an improvement on the original game, and makes me question whether it would be worth playing both Demon's Souls and Demon's Souls Remake, or whether the remake takes precedence over the original. I personally think it's a good remake, However, there was big lost potential within the gameplay. When you look at the success of Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, you can see how FromSoft is innovating the gameplay each time. The Demon's Souls remake felt like it was capable of this as well. It just needed a bit more time spent developing the systems it had in place that aren't found in other Souls games. Developing systems is something the Final Fantasy franchise has been doing a lot of in recent years. The shift from turn-based to real-time combat has drawn in a lot of new players. With this in mind, Final Fantasy fan or not, it's hard to deny the innovation of the Final Fantasy VII Remake compared to the original game. This ongoing remake series is one of the most anticipated of recent years, with the original Final Fantasy VII making waves. It altered people's perceptions of JRPGs and showed how far the narrative could be pushed within the genre. Visually, it's been updated from its quirky animations to current-gen Final Fantasy, with the game now in line with Square Enix's current portfolio. Gameplay and narrative changes were also massively changed, with the goal of the remake to build the game from the ground up whilst keeping it new and nostalgic for old and new players alike. Achieving this goal and selling over 7 million units, it's easy to see why this remake was considered a massive success. Final Fantasy VII was originally released on the PlayStation and PC, making the controls and visuals feel outdated to contemporary audiences. Unlike Capcom, Square Enix had already seen the success of the new direction the Final Fantasy series had taken. In terms of innovation, new graphics and gameplay had been tried and tested within other titles. The remake combines these alterations and creates a game that feels new in its own right, whilst not overshadowing the original. A remake that might overshadow its source material is Dead Space. A controversial take, I know. The original Dead Space is a classic, critically acclaimed for innovating the survival horror genre. The remake was built upon in a similar way Capcom approached Resident Evil, but perhaps not to the same grandeur and scale. Nonetheless, a very solid reimagining of the original game, building on the chilling atmosphere, player choices and systems, and grotesque animations. An example of a developed system is the circuit. In the original, you needed to power circuit breakers in order to progress to the next area. In the remake, they added to this. Not only did you have to find a way to restore power, you were also forced into making a choice. Of course, you have limited power, so the player must choose between oxygen, powering the door to the next area, or your light source. Realizing you're being forced into darkness, knowing that there are monsters lurking behind every corner, warrants only one reaction. No, I don't think I will. They didn't completely remove the previous system of needing to restore power to progress. They understood how fundamental these small mechanics were within the game, and expanded on them with the game design advancements we've made since its release in 2008. The Dead Space remake clearly innovates systems from the original game, creating a more intense and gory entry to the franchise. I do feel, however, that unless you were interested in how the Dead Space series started, there would be little point in playing the original game. The remake does so well at retelling the story with improved gameplay that you don't really experience anything new from the original. The original definitely isn't a bad game, but the remake is just, well, better. Originally, I thought that a good remake starts with picking the right game, following a formula that works, as well as adding value to the original game. Whilst these points still stand, I think innovation plays a much more important role than I initially thought. Demon's Souls created more immersive environments and bosses through new technology, whilst keeping the gameplay true to the original Souls games. It fulfilled the fantasy of being a demon slayer in a medieval world. Although there might be less reason to play the original Demon's Souls because of the remake, Bluepoint Games were incredibly respectful in regards to the integrity and game design choices of the original, making it feel like a worthy substitute. The Dead Space remake also discourages the player from experiencing the original, but not without good reason. The remake did such an impressive job of reworking systems and evolving its survival horror aspects that it lets you experience the original in a more intense and scary way. The Last of Us Part 1 feels like they looked at the original and went, "This isn't good enough." Part 1 has a sense of disrespect to the original ideas and game design, as if they weren't happy with the project that was released back in 2013. This might be why so much of the community was annoyed with The Last of Us remake, as it didn't add value for most people given many already owned the remaster. Plus, it felt as though they weren't only disrespecting the original game, but also the journeys and experiences of gamers that had played it. This is in comparison to the remakes, which feel like games in their own right. They're different enough from the original to feel like a new experience, whilst still respecting the source material and understanding they wouldn't be alive without the realizations of the games that came before. You can feel they're acknowledging the greatness of their predecessors, and are innovating upon them. Square Enix has started to remake Final Fantasy VII to fit in with their modern franchises, creating a different visual perspective of beloved characters with an updated combat system, building upon the narrative of the original game. It doesn't overshadow the original game, with the player gaining more value from playing the original and the remake due to potential plot changes. Each of these games looked at what made them so compelling in the first place, and built upon them, adding new mechanics, dialogue, visual effects, and more. The Last of Us, however, seemed to have overlooked what compelled people to play it in the first place, and saw the main value as its visual appearance. The difference between The Last of Us and Demon's Souls is that Bluepoint understood that improving the visuals added value to that specific game. The spectacle of the world and the bosses are part of what made Demon's Souls such a compelling experience. For The Last of Us, it was the narrative. Maybe they should have just made it a visual novel instead or something, I don't know. After researching and looking at the most notable remakes of recent years, it's hard to come up with many that didn't hit the mark. The Last of Us Part 1 is the only game that feels like it doesn't belong, with the changes they made not being innovative enough to qualify as a good remake, and much less for the £69 price tag they sold it for at launch. But hey, that's my personal take. So basically, companies should be caring about the games they're making, yeah?